The temperature on the high plains had already dropped 20 degrees since noon, a sure sign that the first killing frost was not weeks away, but hours. Amos stood on the porch of the ranch house he had built with his own hands 40 years prior, watching the sun dip below the jagged horizon line of the Dakota Territory. His hands, calloused and mapped with the geography of decades of labor, rested on the rough-hewn railing. He was 70 years old, a man made of gristle and silence, and he was being evicted from the warmth of his own life. The door behind him opened, not with the welcoming creak he knew, but with a sharp, impatient snap. Gideon stepped out. Gideon, who had married Amos's daughter Sarah 3 years ago, and who had slowly, methodically stripped Amos of his title, his cattle, and now his room. Gideon was a man of ledgers and appearances, soft in the middle but hard in the eyes, the kind of man who viewed a ranch not as a legacy of blood and soil, but as an asset to be squeezed until it ran dry. "It's time, old man," Gideon said, his voice carrying the flat effect of a banker closing a foreclosure. He did not look Amos in the eye, preferring to stare out at the darkening pasture where the wind was kicking up dust devils that danced like ghosts. "Sarah and I have talked. With the baby coming, we need the room. And frankly, you're not pulling your weight anymore. You cough all night. It keeps the house awake." Amos turned slowly. He looked past Gideon to the window where Sarah stood, her face pale and pressed against the glass, a portrait of guilt and paralysis. She did not wave. She did not open the door. She simply watched, letting the silence serve as her signature on the eviction order. "The bunkhouse is full," Gideon continued, checking his pocket watch as if sticking to a train schedule. "And I won't have you sleeping in the kitchen. It's unsanitary. You can take the tack room in the north barn. It's dry enough. If you work for your keep, mending harness, sharpening tools will plate you dinner. But you eat on the porch. I won't have you glooming up the table." It was a death sentence disguised as a mercy. The north barn was little more than a wind tunnel, a structure Amos had intended to tear down 5 years ago before his back gave out. The tack room was an uninsulated closet of single-ply pine boards with gaps wide enough to pass a silver dollar through. To send a man of 70 out there in late October, with the winter of 1888 coiling to strike, was not a housing arrangement. It was passive murder. Amos looked at Gideon, studying the softness of the younger man's jaw, the arrogance of a man who had never had to fight the land for a meal. "The north barn," Amos said, his voice rasping like dry leaves on stone. "That roof leaks," Gideon shrugged, turning back to the warmth of the house. "Then you better fix it before the snow flies. You have an hour of light left. Don't waste it." The door slammed, the lock tumbled, and Amos was left alone with the rising wind. He did not plead. He did not rage. He simply walked down the steps, his boots heavy on the frost-hardened earth, and began the calculation of survival. Amos moved his possessions in 3 trips, a humiliating parade of a life reduced to scraps. He had a wool blanket that smelled of horse sweat, a canvas tarp, a lantern with half a reservoir of kerosene, a small box of carpentry tools, and a tin cup. The tack room was exactly as he remembered. A 10-by-10 box attached to the side of the main barn structure, facing due north into the teeth of the prevailing wind. As he stepped inside, the temperature difference was negligible. The wind whistled through the warped siding, carrying with it the metallic scent of snow. He lit the lantern, the weak yellow light revealing the dust motes swirling in the draft. It was 32 degrees inside the room. By midnight it would be 10. By January it would be 20 below zero. He sat on an overturned crate and took inventory of his situation. He had no stove. Gideon had forbidden him from taking the pot-bellied stove from the shed, claiming it was needed for the new smokehouse. Without a heat source, the tack room was a coffin. If he tried to insulate the walls with hay, the dampness would eventually turn to rot and mildew, bringing sickness to his lungs. If he tried to seal the cracks with mud, it would freeze and crumble within days. The physics of the situation were absolute. A human body generates roughly 300 to 400 BTUs of heat at rest. In a drafty room of this size, that heat would dissipate instantly. He would be burning calories just to shiver, and Gideon would likely ration the food to a point where Amos couldn't maintain his body temperature. He would fall asleep one night in December and simply not wake up. Amos stood and paced the small square of the floor. The wood beneath his boots was rotting, spongy with years of neglect and water seepage from the hill behind the barn. He kicked at a loose board. It came up with a wet tearing sound, revealing the dark, packed earth beneath. He stared at the dirt. It was black, dense, and smelled of ancient decay. He knelt, placing his hand on the soil. Felt cool but not freezing. He remembered the root cellars of his youth, how the potatoes stayed unfrozen even when the drifts were 10 feet deep outside. The earth was a battery. Below the frost line, the ground maintained a constant temperature of roughly 50 degrees, regardless of the blizzard raging above. The solution wasn't to build up. It was to go down. Gideon saw the barn as a storage locker for a useless old man. Amos saw it as a camouflage. He wouldn't live in the tack room. He would live under it. But he had to do it without a single sound, without a pile of dirt giving him away, and he had to finish before the ground froze solid. He had days, maybe less. The plan formed in his mind with the precision of an architectural blueprint. The tack room floor was raised about 2 feet off the ground on stone pillars to keep the timber from rotting, but over the decades, the soil had built up around the perimeter, sealing the crawl space from view but not from the damp. If he could lift the floorboards carefully, he could excavate a pit directly beneath the room. He would need to go down 4 feet. Combined with the 2-foot clearance, that would give him 6 feet of standing room. The earth walls, if shored up properly, would insulate him. The floor of the tack room above would become his ceiling, a false bottom that hid his existence. He tested the pry bar against the far corner of the room, wincing as the nail screeched. He paused, holding his breath, listening for the slam of a door or the crunch of boots on gravel. Silence. The wind was his ally tonight. It masked the small noises of his rebellion. He worked the board loose, then the next and the next, numbering them with a piece of charcoal so they could be replaced exactly. By the time he had exposed a 3x3 patch of earth, his breathing was ragged, and his hands were trembling. He took the short-handled spade from his toolbox. The ground was hard-packed clay for the first few inches, resisting the blade, sending shocks up his arms into his arthritic shoulders. He had to chip at it, breaking the crust before he could scoop. The problem, he realized immediately, was displacement. A hole 6 feet deep and 8 feet wide would produce nearly 300 cubic feet of loose soil. He couldn't just throw it outside. A fresh dirt pile in the snow would draw Gideon's eye instantly. He had to hide the earth. Amos looked at the structure of the main barn adjoining the tack room. The stalls on the other side of the wall were built on a raised platform to allow for drainage. There was a void space under the main barn floor, a dark, rat-infested crawl space that ran the length of the building. He could shuttle the dirt there, spreading it flat in the darkness where no one ever looked. It would double his labor. Every shovelful had to be dug, carried, and hidden. He calculated the volume. It would take thousands of trips. He gripped the shovel handle, his knuckles white. He wasn't digging a grave. He was digging a fortress. He took the first scoop of earth, the smell of damp soil filling the small, freezing room, and began the work that would either save him or kill him. For the next 4 nights, Amos ceased to be a man and became a machine driven by the fear of freezing. He slept in 90-minute bursts during the day, curled in the corner of the tack room with the floorboards replaced and covered by his canvas tarp to hide the seams. When the sun went down and the lights in the main house flickered out, he began. He pried up the boards. He dropped into the hole, which grew deeper by the hour. He dug until his vision blurred, counting the shovel loads to keep his mind from snapping. 100 scoops. Rest for a count of 10. Another 100. The soil changed as he went deeper, shifting from the frozen crust to a heavy, moist loam that clung to the steel blade. The physical toll was catastrophic. His hands blistered, then the blisters tore, and then the raw skin hardened into something leather-like and unfeeling. His back locked up so tightly that he sometimes had to crawl out of the pit on his hands and knees, unable to straighten his spine until he had lain flat on the floorboards for 10 minutes. But as he went deeper, the temperature shifted. On the third night, a blizzard howled outside, dropping the ambient temperature to 5 degrees. Inside the tack room, water in his tin cup froze solid. But 4 feet down in the pit, in the still, dead air of the earth, it was 45 degrees. It felt tropical compared to the biting wind above. The earth was radiating the heat it had stored all summer. He encountered a massive granite boulder in the northeast corner on the 4th night. It was immovable, too large to dig out and too hard to break. Panic flared in his chest. If he couldn't clear the space, he wouldn't have room to lay flat. He sat in the dirt, sweat cooling dangerously on his skin, and stared at the rock. He realized he didn't need to move it. He could use it. It would serve as a heat sink if he could ever risk a small candle, and it provided a solid shelf for his tools. He dug around it, incorporating the obstacle into the design. He used the scrap wood he had scavenged from the barn's discard pile to shore up the earthen walls, creating a crude retaining wall to prevent collapse. He left a gap between the top of the retaining wall and the floorboards above, a ventilation channel that would pull fresh air from the gaps in the siding down into the pit, but not enough to freeze him. By the time the sun threatened the eastern horizon on the 5th morning, the excavation was done. He had a subterranean chamber 6 feet deep, 6 feet wide, and 8 feet long. He replaced the floorboards for the final time, hinging a section in the corner beneath his bedroll to act as a trapdoor. He collapsed onto the blanket, his body vibrating with exhaustion, listening to the rooster crow. He had built his ship. Now he had to survive the voyage. The first week of living underground required a psychological adjustment that was more difficult than the physical labor. Amos established a regimen that revolved around invisibility. During the daylight hours, he was the broken old man Gideon expected to see. He sat on the porch of the tack room or worked slowly in the main barn repairing harnesses, his movements deliberately sluggish. He accepted the meager plate of food Sarah brought him, usually cold stew or stale cornbread, with a nod of gratitude that tasted like bile. He let them see him shivering. He let Gideon smirk at the way he wrapped the wool blanket around his shoulders. It was all theater. At dusk, he would retreat to the tack room and go to bed. He blew out the lantern so the cracks in the wall showed only darkness. He waited 1 hour for the house to settle. Then, he moved the bedroll, lifted the trapdoor, and descended into the sanctuary. The difference in atmosphere was instant. The air down there was heavy, smelling of soil and raw pine, but it was still. The wind that battered the walls above was just a distant, rhythmic thumping, like the heartbeat of a large animal. He had scavenged a handful of tallow candles, cutting them in half to make them last. He would light one, the tiny flame illuminating his earthen cell. The granite boulder he had uncovered served as his table. He had fashioned a sleeping ledge carved into the hard clay, lined with dried straw he had stolen pocketful by pocketful from the main barn, covered with his canvas tarp. The most dangerous element was sound. Sound traveled strangely through the ground. When Gideon or the ranch hands walked into the tack room above to fetch a bridle, their footsteps sounded like thunderclaps directly on Amos's skull. Dust would sift down through the cracks in the floorboards, coating his face. He learned to freeze, holding his breath, terrified that a cough or a shift in weight would betray him. One afternoon, while Amos was ostensibly napping, but actually down in the pit reinforcing a wall, Gideon entered the room above. "Useless old badger," Gideon muttered, the voice clear and close, separated from Amos by only 2 inches of pine. Amos watched the floorboards flex under Gideon's weight. A heavy boot heel stomped directly over Amos's head. Probably dead in here already, Amos pressed his hand over his mouth, his eyes fixed on the gap between the boards. He could see the leather of Gideon's boot sole. A single sneeze, a creak of the makeshift bench, and it would be over. Gideon paused, shifting his weight. He was looking for something. Dust rained down into Amos's eye, stinging, but he didn't blink. After an eternity, Gideon grunted, spat on the floor, the spit dripping through the crack and landing inches from Amos's knee, and walked out. Amos exhaled, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The close call solidified a new rule. During the day, the trapdoor stayed shut, and he stayed above, no matter how cold it got. The underground was for the night, and the nights were getting longer. November bled into December, bringing with it a darkness that seemed to stain the very air. The initial triumph of the excavation faded into a grim, subterranean routine of dampness and deprivation. While the earth provided insulation from the lethal winds scouring the plains, it exacted a tax in moisture. The humidity in Amos's burrow was nearly 100%. His clothes never fully dried, clinging to his skin like a second, cold layer of flesh. Mold began to spot the leather of his boots and the corners of his canvas tarp. To combat the rot, he developed a system of ventilation that required agonizing discipline. During the windiest hours of the night, he would crack the trapdoor open an inch, allowing the dry, freezing air from the tack room to cycle through the pit. It dropped the temperature in his den dangerously low, shivering him awake, but it sucked the moisture out of the clay walls. It was a trade: freeze for an hour to stay dry for a day. Hunger became the loudest noise in the silence. Gideon's promised meals had dwindled to sporadic insults. A bucket of watery grits left on the porch steps, often frozen by the time Amos retrieved it, or stale heels of bread that were hard enough to crack a tooth. Amos began to consume his own body. His belt tightened notch by notch until he had to bore new holes in the leather with an awl. He moved with a conservation of energy that bordered on the reptilian. Every motion was calculated. Lift the cup, drink, lower the cup. No guastid gestures. He spent hours lying in the dark, staring at the dirt ceiling, listening to the muffled drama of the ranch unfolding above him. The earth carried sound with startling clarity. He heard the heavy, angry footsteps of Gideon pacing the barn aisle, the slap of a ledger book against a rail, and the sharp, rising tones of arguments with the ranch hands. Gideon was firing men. Amos could hear the dismissals, the desperate pleas of hands who had nowhere to go in winter, and Gideon's flat refusal to pay for idleness. The workforce was shrinking, leaving the cattle vulnerable. But Amos could do nothing but listen and chew on a strip of dried beef he had squirreled away in his pocket weeks ago. His health began to fray at the edges. A persistent cough settled deep in his chest, a wet rattle that he had to smother in his wool blanket whenever footsteps approached the tack room. If Gideon heard him sick, he would use it as an excuse to ship him off to the county sanitarium, a place from which no old man ever returned. So Amos swallowed the coughs until his eyes watered and his ribs ached. He became a ghost haunting his own property, visible only during the brief windows of the day when he emerged to perform the menacingly slow labor Gideon demanded. He would sweep the barn floor, his breath pluming in the frigid air, watching Gideon struggle with tasks Amos could have done in his sleep. He saw the younger man fumbling with the intricate knots of the hay pulleys, cursing as the ropes slipped. Amos said nothing. He offered no advice. The time for teaching had passed. This was the time for witnessing. The real test arrived in mid-January, heralded not by snow, but by a sudden, terrifying drop in pressure that made Amos's ears pop even 6 feet underground. The sky turned a bruised, sickly purple, and the birds fell silent. It was the schoolhouse blizzard pattern, a fast-moving wall of white death that had killed hundreds in the territory before. Amos sensed the vibration in the ground before he heard the wind. It started as a low hum, vibrating through the granite boulder in the corner of his den, and escalated within minutes to a roar that sounded like a freight train passing directly overhead. The temperature plummeted. Above ground, the mercury dropped 40 degrees in 3 hours. Amos retreated to his pit and sealed the trapdoor tight. He wedged his spare shirt into the ventilation gap he usually left open. Tonight, the cold air would not be a refreshing draft, but a killing frost. He lit his last tallow candle, not for light, but for the tiny, psychological comfort of the flame and the fraction of heat it threw against the stone. The world above ceased to exist as a visual reality and became a sonic nightmare. The wind shrieked through the barn's siding, tearing loose shingles and slamming doors. The structure of the tack room groaned, the timber frame flexing under the assault. Dust and grit rained down on Amos's face from the floorboards above. He pulled his knees to his chest, wrapped in every piece of fabric he owned, and waited. Sometime around midnight, the screaming of the cattle began. It was a muffled, panicked sound filtering through the dirt. The herd had drifted against the south wall of the barn seeking shelter, but the wind was relentless. They were piling up, crushing each other, freezing where they stood. Amos squeezed his eyes shut. He knew exactly what was happening. Gideon, in his arrogance, had sold the windbreaks to a lumber mill in November for quick cash, thinking the barn would be enough. Now, with the wind chill hitting 50 below, the cattle were exposed. Amos felt a surge of rage so hot it almost warmed him. Those animals were the lineage of stock he had bred for 30 years, and they were dying because a ledgerman thought he could negotiate with winter. The screaming slowly faded as the night wore on, replaced by the relentless hammering of the wind. The silence that followed was worse. It was the silence of a graveyard. The storm raged for 2 days without pause. On the morning of the third day, the wind died down, leaving a paralyzed, frozen world. Amos had not eaten in 48 hours. His water supply was a block of ice he chipped at with a chisel, melting shards in his mouth. He was weak, light-headed, and his limbs felt heavy, as if his blood had turned to syrup. He knew he had to check the ventilation. If the snow had drifted over the cracks in the tackroom siding, the air supply in the pit would stifle, and he would suffocate in his sleep. He pushed up on the trapdoor. It didn't budge. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in his chest. He pushed harder, bracing his back against the granite boulder and shoving with his legs. The wood groaned but held fast. A snowdrift had likely piled up against the tackroom door, or perhaps the roof had partially collapsed, pinning the floorboards down. He was trapped. He sat back in the darkness, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He analyzed the physics of his tomb. He had air for maybe 6 hours, depending on how porous the snow above was. He grabbed his pry bar. He would have to dismantle the floor from below, board by board, and try to dig his way up through the snow inside the room. He was just fitting the metal tip into the seam of the trapdoor when he heard a new sound. It wasn't the wind. It was the crunch of heavy boots on the floorboards directly above his head. Someone was in the tackroom. "It's freezing in here, Gideon. The wood is dry. Just take it." It was Sarah's voice, shrill and bordered by hysteria. Amos froze, the pry bar poised inches from the wood. "I can't tear down the support beams, Sarah. The roof will come down," Gideon's voice replied, shaking with a tremor Amos had never heard before. "We'll take the siding. Start with the interior planks." They were freezing. The main house must have lost its heat. Perhaps the chimney had cracked in the cold, or they had simply run out of coal, unable to reach the supply shed in the drifts. They had come to the tackroom not to check on Amos, but to cannibalize the room for firewood. Amos listened as a hammer claw smashed into the wall paneling. They were dismantling his shelter. If they pulled the wrong board or ripped up the floor for fuel, they would find him. Or worse, they would expose the pit to the sub-zero air while he was still inside it. Amos made a choice. He could not stay hidden while they tore the roof down on top of him. He reached up, unlatched the lock on the trapdoor, and shoved upward with all his remaining strength. The floorboards lifted, dumping a cascade of dirt and straw into the pit. Above, Sarah screamed, a short, sharp intake of breath. Amos stood up, his head rising through the floor like a corpse returning from the grave. The scene in the tackroom was grim. Gideon was huddled in a buffalo coat that was far too big for him, clutching a crowbar. Sarah was wrapped in quilts, her lips blue, her eyes wide with terror as she looked at the hole in the floor. The room was freezing, the air glittering with frost dust. Gideon stumbled back, raising the crowbar as if to strike, his face a mask of confusion and fear. "You," Gideon stammered, his teeth chattering violently. We thought you froze. The bunkhouse. The men are gone. We thought you were dead." Amos didn't look at Gideon. He looked at the wall where they had started ripping off the planks. "You pull those boards," Amos rasped, his voice rusty from disuse, "and the wind takes the roof. Then you die for sure." He climbed out of the hole, his movements stiff but steady. He was dirty, bearded, and smelled of the earth, but he was standing straighter than Gideon. He looked at Sarah. She was shivering uncontrollably, the early stages of hypothermia setting in. "The house?" Amos asked. "Stove blew back," Gideon whispered, the arrogance completely stripped away by the cold. "Smoke everywhere. Can't stay in there. We needed wood." Amos shook his head. "Wood won't save you now. Fire won't get hot enough before the frost takes your fingers." He pointed to the hole in the floor. "Get down." Gideon stared at the dark pit. "What? No, it's a grave. You dug a grave." "It's 50 degrees down there," Amos said, his tone flat and non-negotiable. "I have a candle. I have dry straw. You want the girl and the baby to live? You put them in the ground." Gideon looked at the hole, then at the frost creeping across the window pane, sealing them in. He looked at Sarah, who was already swaying on her feet. The ledgerman had no numbers for this. He had no authority over the thermodynamics of a blizzard. He lowered the crowbar. The hierarchy of the ranch dissolved in that moment, replaced by the brutal meritocracy of survival. Gideon nodded, a sharp, jerky motion. "Help her," he said, his voice cracking. Amos didn't hesitate. He guided Sarah to the edge of the pit and helped her lower herself into the warmth of the earth. He forced Gideon to go next. The younger man was clumsy, his fine boots slipping on the clay, stripping him of his last shred of dignity as he crawled into the hole his father-in-law had dug. Amos followed, pulling the trapdoor shut above them, plunging them into the absolute darkness of the burrow. He lit the candle. The tiny flame illuminated their faces. Sarah pale and exhausted, Gideon looking around the reinforced walls, the stone shelf, the impossible engineering of the old man's survival. The heat from the earth wrapped around them, stagnant but saving. Gideon huddled in the corner, knees to his chest. He touched the dry earth wall. "You were here," Gideon whispered. "The whole time. You were right here." Amos broke a piece of his hardtack and handed it to Sarah. "Eat," he said. He didn't offer any to Gideon. He didn't have to. The lesson was already being served. They stayed in the earth for 3 days. The storm blew itself out, leaving the world buried under 6 feet of snow. But in the burrow, time was measured only by the length of the candle and the rhythm of their breathing. The dynamic had permanently inverted. Amos was the master of this domain. Gideon was the dependent. Amos rationed the water. Amos checked the air. Amos decided when they slept. There were no arguments, no threats of eviction. In the dark, Gideon's bluster evaporated, leaving behind a frightened boy who realized he knew nothing about the land he claimed to own. When the dripping from the ceiling signaled the beginning of the thaw, Amos pushed the trapdoor open. A shaft of blinding white sunlight pierced the gloom. They emerged into a ruined world. The main barn roof had collapsed under the weight of the snow, crushing the loft. The carcasses of the cattle that had been left without windbreaks were dark mounds in the white field, frozen statues of Gideon's negligence. The main house was standing but gutted by the smoke and cold damage. It would take months to repair, but they were alive. Gideon stood on the porch of the tack room, blinking in the glare, looking out at the devastation his decisions had amplified. He turned to Amos. The old man was leaning against the railing, watching a hawk circle the blue sky. Gideon opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to issue an order, perhaps to salvage some scrap of his former pride. But he looked at Amos's hands, the hands that had moved tons of earth in secret, the hands that had built the only warm place on the ranch, and the words died in his throat. "I'll clear the south pasture," Gideon said quietly, looking at his boots. For the few head left, it was a question, not a statement. He was asking permission. He was asking for guidance. Amos didn't look at him. He watched the hawk dive. "Don't clear it yet," Amos said, his voice even. "Ground's too soft. You'll tear up the grass. Wait for the mud to firm." Gideon nodded. "Right. Wait for the mud." He walked away toward the ruin of the barn. His shoulders slumped, a man burdened finally by the weight of consequence. Amos remained on the porch. He didn't smile. There was no joy in the victory, only the cold satisfaction of physics. The land didn't care about deeds or titles or bank accounts. It only respected one thing, the ability to endure. And as the sun began to warm the frozen planks beneath his feet, Amos knew he had bought himself more than just a winter. He had bought his place on the earth until the day he chose to leave it.